At the beginning of 1945, humanity was living in a war, but a familiar one. Terrible, bloody, total, but still one whose logic people believed they understood. The war had already lasted 6 years, and it seemed to have exhausted all possible forms of horror. Millions dead, destroyed cities, burned villages, concentration camps, bombings. All of this had become part of a new normal. The world had grown accustomed to death measured in scale, but not in immediacy. Fronts still existed. The war still had geography. Maps showed lines of advance, directions of attacks, bridgeheads and encirclements. Soldiers were dying by the thousands, but not in an instant. Cities were being destroyed, but over days, weeks, months. Even the most terrible bombings of London, Dresden, or Tokyo were perceived as a continuation of a logic. More planes, more destruction. Horror was measured by quantity, not by absoluteness. In people's minds, war remained the affair of armies. Yes, civilians suffered, but in most minds, soldiers were the primary victims and main participants. Victory meant defeating the enemy army, capturing the capital, forcing a government to surrender. Even total war in the 20th century still fit within certain frameworks. To win, you needed more people, more machinery, time. Even new technologies, tanks, strategic aviation, V-2 rockets, did not break this picture. They accelerated the war, made it larger in scale, but did not change its essence. Every weapon could be imagined as a continuation of the previous one: a bigger gun, a faster plane, a more powerful bomb. Humanity still thought in terms of gradations of war, not leaps. States planned the future according to this logic. After the war, someone would lose, someone would win, someone would rebuild. Generals thought about the next campaigns, politicians about post-war borders, economists about reconstruction. Even the most pessimistic scenarios did not include one thing: the possibility that a single event could erase all plans at once. Humanity still believed that war was a process in which one could adapt, adjust, learn to survive. If a city was bombed, you built bomb shelters. If the enemy advanced, you established a new line of defense. If casualties were high, you mobilized new soldiers. Even death was something people tried to get used to. And that was the main illusion at the beginning of 1945. The world did not yet realize that it was on the threshold of a weapon that left no time to adaptation. A weapon against which there was no front, no rear, no shelter, no second chance. A weapon that did not destroy gradually, it erased everything instantly. All previous wars, however horrific, still allowed a person to hope for survival through effort, courage, or luck. That hope was still alive at the beginning of 1945. Humanity did not yet know that very soon war would cease to be a question of endurance and would become a matter of a single decision, a single plane, and a single second. While millions of soldiers fought on the fronts of World War II, an event was unfolding in complete secrecy, one that would not merely change the course of a single war, but the very nature of armed conflict itself. For the first time in human history, war ceased to be a matter of gradual destruction and became a question of the instant annihilation of entire cities. The Manhattan Project was not just a scientific program. It was a concentration of fear,
resources, and intellect on an unprecedented scale. The United States gathered the world's best physicists, people who until recently had been working in universities, writing theoretical papers, and could hardly imagine that their formulas could become weapons of mass destruction. Many of them were European émigrés who had fled Nazism and now were working on a project meant to end the war at any cost. The essence of the new weapon did not lie in the size of the explosion, but in principle. The atomic bomb was not more artillery. It broke the very logic of war. Victory previously required time, masses, resources, and the exhaustion of the enemy. Now, a single plane, a single target, and a single order were enough to erase an entire city from the map in mere seconds. It's important to understand, at the moment this weapon was created, no one knew all the consequences. Scientists understood that the explosion would be colossal, but they did not have a complete understanding of radiation, long-term effects, or environmental consequences. The atomic weapon was developed under conditions of fear, where the primary question was not what will happen next, but can we get there before the enemy? And this fear was real. The American leadership seriously feared that Nazi Germany might create a similar weapon first. This possibility, even unconfirmed, yet terrifying enough, became one of the main drivers of the project. The war accelerated science in ways impossible during peacetime. In 1945, the world still did not realize that the emergence of the atomic bomb meant not just a new weapon, but a new era. From that moment on, war between great powers was no longer merely a military matter. It became a question of the survival of civilization. Every subsequent conflict now had an invisible line beyond which mutual annihilation began. The birth of the atomic weapon divided history into before and after. In the world before, wars were disasters. In the world after, they became the potential end of everything. And although at first the atomic bomb was seen as a means to end one war, in reality, it permanently changed all wars to come. From that moment, humanity began living not just in an era of wars, but in an era of deterrence. And fear never again left international politics.
On August 6, 1945, the war ceased to be an abstraction, even for those who had never seen the front. On that day, a single event showed humanity a boundary it could never again retreat from. Hiroshima was not Japan's largest city, nor its main military capital. It became a symbol, not because it was unique, but precisely because it was ordinary. Hundreds of thousands of civilians lived there. Schools, hospitals, and factories operated, and people woke up in the morning thinking about everyday matters. This is what made the strike so shocking. The war suddenly arrived where it was least expected. The atomic bomb explosion destroyed the city not as a result of prolonged combat, but as an instantaneous act. In seconds, tens of thousands of people died. Those closest to the epicenter simply vanished, not killed, not wounded, but ceased to exist. This was a new phenomenon in the history of violence. Death without a fight, without a chance, without time to fear. But the real horror began after the explosion. Those who survived encountered an invisible enemy, burns without flames, illnesses without wounds, slow deaths without an apparent cause. Radiation did not look like a weapon, yet it acted as relentlessly.
Doctors did not understand what was happening, had no treatment protocols, and often became victims themselves of what they were trying to combat. The world learned about Hiroshima in fragments, at first as a super-powerful bomb, then as a city that had vanished. Only over time did it become clear that this was not just a new form of destruction, but a fundamentally different level of threat. For the first time, one nation could, with a single strike, not just win, but demonstrate the potential to destroy an entire civilization. Nagasaki, struck a few days later, only reinforced this realization. It was no longer an accident or an experiment. It was a signal. Such a weapon exists, and it could be used again. For Japan, these strikes marked the end of the war. For the world, they heralded the beginning of a new fear. War no longer required millions of soldiers and years of combat. It could end with a single decision made far from the battlefield. Hiroshima destroyed not only the city, it destroyed the illusion of a safe rear. From that point on, no city, no country, no civilization could be completely protected. The front was everywhere people lived. After 1945, the world entered a state previously unthinkable. War was no longer only a tragedy of the past, it had become a potential catastrophe of the future. Every political decision, every crisis, every escalation now carried a hidden dimension. What if it crosses the line? Hiroshima provided no answers. It posed questions humanity still has no definitive answers to. How can one live knowing that the push of a button could erase a city? How can one restrain a force without limits? And is humanity capable of controlling a weapon that exceeds its understanding of responsibility? At that moment, history ceased to be linear. It became fragile, and the world realized now it lives not only in the reality of what has been, but in the shadow of what might happen.
After 1945, the world formally returned to peace, but this peace was deceptive. Large-scale wars between states had ceased not because humanity had become more humane, but because war had become too dangerous. With the advent of nuclear weapons, every global conflict carried the risk of mutual annihilation. The Cold War was not a war in the traditional sense. There were no front lines, no formal declarations, no decisive battles between the armies of superpowers. Yet it was a constant struggle over influence, ideology, technology, and fear. It unfolded every day, in every political decision, in every crisis. The United States and the Soviet Union found themselves in a unique and dangerous situation. Both sides possessed enough nuclear weapons to destroy each other and the entire world along with them. For the first time in history, power no longer guaranteed victory. On the contrary, using that power meant defeat for everyone. The concept of deterrence emerged. It was based not on trust, but on fear. Each side had to know, if you strike, the response will be inevitable. It was a paradoxical balance in which peace was maintained not by agreements, but by the mutual threat of destruction. The Cold War permeated everyday life. Children were taught to hide under desks in schools. Cities built bomb shelters. The media constantly reported on the possibility of nuclear war. People lived, worked, and raised families, but with a background sense that it could all vanish in a single night.
Cold War crises demonstrated how thin the line was. The Berlin blockade, the Korean War, the Cuban Missile Crisis. Each of these moments could have been a point of no return, especially in 1962, when the world was literally just days away from a nuclear exchange. It became clear then the survival of civilization depended not only on strategies, but on the restraint of individual people. Despite the constant tension, the Cold War was also a war of development. The arms race spurred space programs, new technologies, and global communication systems. But behind these achievements always loomed a shadow. Most innovations were born out of military necessity, not a desire for progress. Equally important is that the Cold War changed the notion of victory. To win meant not to destroy the enemy, but to outlast them, to survive longer, to preserve the system, to wait for the moment when the other side could no longer endure internal pressure. For entire generations, this became the norm. A world in which nuclear war is possible but does not occur. A world of constant anxiety without an explosion. Humanity learned to live on the edge of catastrophe without staring too long into the abyss. The Cold War ended without a great explosion, but it left a legacy: fear, institutions of deterrence, nuclear arsenals, and the understanding that some lines must never be crossed. It showed that the most dangerous war could be the one that never became hot. And since then, the world has lived with this knowledge. Peace sometimes exists not because we are strong, but because we fear being strong to the very end.
When the Cold War began to fade in the late 1980s, it seemed that humanity had finally emerged from the shadow of nuclear catastrophe. The fall of the Berlin Wall, the collapse of the Soviet Union, the end of global ideological confrontation, all of this was perceived as the finale of a long and dangerous era. A world that had lived in fear for decades suddenly believed that the worst was behind it. For many, it seemed like a victory of common sense. Nuclear war had not occurred. The superpowers had not destroyed each other. The system of deterrence had worked. It seemed that the logic of confrontation no longer made sense, and international politics would gradually become a space for cooperation, trade, and development. The 1990s became a time of hope. People spoke of the end of history, of a world without major wars, where democracy and the market would expand on their own. Military budgets were reduced, nuclear arsenals shrank, borders opened. It seemed that the very possibility of a global conflict was receding into the past along with the 20th century. But this was only a feeling, not reality. What disappeared was not fear, but only its form. Nuclear weapons had not gone anywhere. They remained on active duty, under the control of people, systems, and decisions that could fail. It was just that no one thought about them daily. The world began to live as if the main threat had vanished on its own. At the same time, the nature of conflicts changed. Large-scale wars between states indeed became rare, but in their place appeared local wars, civil conflicts, terrorism, and asymmetrical threats. War was no longer declared and clear. It became blurred, fragmented, and often invisible. The illusion of security created a new vulnerability.
States grew accustomed to peace as a norm and began to take stability for granted. Political decisions were made without considering that old mechanisms of deterrence could fail. The world became more complex, more interconnected, and at the same time, less controllable. The end of the Cold War did not mean the end of history. It meant the loss of a clear structure of fear. The world had once known where the line was drawn. Now, that line became blurred. Threats did not disappear, but they ceased to be obvious, and that is what made them dangerous. Humanity entered the 21st century with the sense that great catastrophes were a thing of the past. Yet beneath the surface of this optimism remained the same elements: nuclear arsenals, geopolitical ambitions, technologies with colossal destructive potential. Only now, people spoke of them less often. The illusion of a safe world was comforting. It allowed life to continue, planning for the future without thinking about the worst. But history rarely forgives self-deception. The end of the Cold War was not the end of threats, it was a pause, during which the world decided to believe it had learned to control its own shadows.
At the beginning of the 21st century, it became clear that the sense of security that had emerged after the Cold War was temporary. The world did not become more stable. It simply stopped confronting its fears for a while. But the fear did not disappear. It merely changed form. The events of the early 2000s shattered the illusion that large-scale conflicts were a thing of the past. Terrorism, asymmetric wars, attacks without fronts or declarations demonstrated that threats no longer always bore a national flag. War returned to cities, to civilian life, to everyday reality. It became unexpected once again. At the same time, classical geopolitics began to return. States that had recently spoken of cooperation once again started thinking in terms of spheres of influence, borders, and power. Armies were modernized, military budgets increased, and nuclear rhetoric, once considered a relic of the 20th century, reappeared in the public sphere. Technology made the world faster and at the same time more fragile. Cyber attacks, information warfare, and infrastructure interference became new battlefields. Conflict no longer required tanks or aircraft to paralyze a country. It was enough to disrupt communications, energy systems, or societal trust. The most dangerous aspect was that old mechanisms of deterrence were less effective. The world was no longer divided into two clear camps. There were more centers of power, interests were more complex, and rules less clear. In such a system, mistakes became more likely and responsibility more diffuse. Nuclear weapons returned to the discourse not as an abstract fear, but as a real tool of pressure. They ceased to be merely the last argument and began to be used at the level of threats and signals. This marked a return to the dangerous threshold the world had once crossed. For society, this return of fear had a different character than in the 20th century. People no longer built bomb shelters in every backyard, but they lived amidst a constant informational noise of anxiety. News, notifications, and headlines created a sense of instability without a clear focal point. The world again found itself in a situation where the future did not seem guaranteed. But unlike during the Cold War,
There was no single logic of fear that restrained everyone. Each conflict had its own rules, risks, and dynamics. The return of fear did not mean an inevitable catastrophe. It meant the return of responsibility. History once again reminded us that progress does not eliminate threats, it only changes their form. The world entered a new phase, less predictable, more fragmented, and no less dangerous. And it is precisely in this state, between memory of the past and uncertainty about the future, that humanity lives today.
When we look at the 20th century from a historical distance, there is a temptation to see it as an anomaly. 2 world wars, totalitarian regimes, genocides, nuclear weapons, all of this seems too concentrated, too horrific, to be considered the norm of human history. It is easy to believe that it was an exception, one that would never happen again. But that is precisely the main mistake. The 20th century was not a deviation from history. It was an acceleration of it. All the forces that have always existed manifested themselves there. The struggle for power, fear of the enemy, faith in technology as a solution, and the willingness to sacrifice human lives for abstract ideas. Only for the first time, these forces acted on a global scale. Technological progress did not make humanity morally wiser. It merely gave it the tools to exert influence faster and on a larger scale. What once took decades now happened in years. What once destroyed cities could now annihilate civilizations. The 20th century showed that development without responsibility does not lead to security. The wars of this century shattered the illusion of gradual progress. It became clear that education, science, and culture do not guarantee humanity. Highly industrialized societies can create not only prosperity, but also factories of death. Rationality can serve not only life, but also destruction. The most important lesson of the 20th century is that catastrophes rarely come suddenly. They develop gradually through fear, polarization, the devaluation of human life, and the normalization of violence. By the time a catastrophe becomes obvious, stopping it is almost impossible. The Cold War demonstrated that even in a world with colossal destructive power, people are capable of restraining themselves from self-destruction. But it also proved how fragile that balance is. Peace based on fear is not a final solution. It is merely a temporary pause. The 20th century left us not a recipe, but a warning. It showed the limits beyond which one cannot go without consequences. It showed that history does not have an automatic, happy ending, and that each generation again faces the same choices, only in new circumstances. Today, the world is far more complex, faster, and interconnected than ever before. This means that mistakes can have even greater consequences. The memory of the 20th century is important not because it gives a sense of moral superiority, but because it reminds us that nothing is guaranteed. History does not repeat itself literally, but it constantly poses similar questions. Are we capable of restraining our own power? Are we ready to take responsibility for the technologies we create? Do we remember where the devaluation of human life leads? The 20th century was not the end of the road. It was a sign by the roadside, a warning that humanity can either heed
or ignore once again. And this is what makes the memory of it not a matter of the past, but a question of the future.